Today's video is brought to you by The Ridge. Usually when I talk about The Ridge, I talk about their amazing wallets. That's because they are durable, come with a lifetime warranty, and they look cool. But this time, I want to talk about their awesome backpacks. I have one of their classic backpacks, and I love it. It's lightweight, and it's weatherproof. It easily holds my laptop, plus whatever I need for the day. I can even hook up my devices to a power pack in the bag so I can charge my devices on the go. It's also a great bag for life during the pandemic because it has a durable nylon shell. So it's easy to keep it clean and safe. I just give it a quick wipe down with a disinfectant wipe. Right now, The Ridge is offering criminally listed viewers 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns. Just go to ridge.com/listed, that's ridge.com/listed, and use the promo code listed at the checkout. Get yourself the best wallet and backpack you'll ever own and help support Criminally Listed by checking out ridge.com/listed. Number 3. Mark Moseley. Mark Moseley was born in March 1948 in Livingston, Texas. 9 years after he was born, his mother gave birth to a daughter, Pamela. Growing up, Moseley played football. He played quarterback in high school and in the first 3 years of college. In his senior year at Stephen F. Austin University, he switched to the position of place kicker. If you are not familiar with American football, place kickers kick field goals and extra points after touchdowns. In 1970, Moseley was drafted 346 overall in the 14th round by the Philadelphia Eagles. He played for them for a season and then he was dropped. Moseley then signed with the Houston Oilers. Once again, he was dropped after just one season. After he was released, no other team wanted to sign him, so he got a day job selling septic tanks. He kept practicing, and he wrote letters to a dozen teams asking for a tryout. His perseverance paid off. In 1974, Moseley was signed by the Washington Redskins. 5 years later, in 1979, he was voted to the Pro Bowl. In 1982, the NFL players went on strike. The strike lasted for 57 days. As a result, the season was only 9 games long instead of 16. Moseley had a fantastic season, making 20 of his 21 field goal attempts. The previous season, Washington was 8-8. In 1982, Washington went 8-1. Washington made it to the Super Bowl where they played the Miami Dolphins. Moseley kicked 2 field goals and 2 extra points. Washington won the Super Bowl 27-17. Moseley was voted MVP, making him the first, and at the time of this video, the only special team player to be chosen as MVP. Mark Moseley retired in 1986 from the Cleveland Browns. In 1979, the same year that Moseley was voted to go to the Pro Bowl, he suffered a horrifying loss. Moseley's 21-year-old sister, Pamela Carpenter, lived in Livingston, Texas with her husband Bruce. Pamela and Bruce had been married for 3 years. They lived in Houston for a short time and their house got broken into. This unsettled them and they became concerned about the crime rate in Houston. So they moved back to Livingston where they grew up. At the time, Livingston had a population of around 5,000 people. On the afternoon of October 28, 1979, 21-year-old Pamela Carpenter was home alone. She was cutting out some Halloween decorations. That afternoon, Pamela called her friend. Pamela said she had been raped and stabbed. Pamela said she needed help and she told her friend to hurry. Her friend rushed to her home and saw Pamela lying in a pool of blood. She ran to a neighbor's home and the neighbor called 911. Pamela Carpenter was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. In the ambulance, Carpenter talked about her attack. She said that a man had come to her door and forced his way in. He was armed with a knife. She described him as a short white male with dark curly hair and he was wearing a plaid shirt. She also said that she had met the man before. The man raped her and stabbed her in the chest with the scissors that she was using to cut out the Halloween decorations. Sadly, 21-year-old Patricia Carpenter died about 2 hours after the attack. Around the same time that Pamela was pronounced dead, the police made an arrest. He was 23-year-old Johnny Paul Penry. Penry had been paroled 3 months earlier after serving 2 years of a 5-year sentence for rape. In February 1977, Penry approached a woman in a department store parking lot. He forced her to get into her car and then made her drive. As she drove, he pulled out a knife and directed her to a remote area. He then forced her to undress and then raped her. Afterward, they were driving and the car became stuck in the mud. So they started walking. A man in a pickup truck came by and Penry said that he and his wife needed a ride. The man allowed them to get into the back of the pickup. When they arrived at a store, the woman started screaming for help. The sheriff's department was called and Penry was arrested. He was convicted of rape and he was sentenced to 5 years of prison. He was released in August 1979, about 3 months before Pamela was killed. When the sheriff's deputy heard the description of Pamela's attacker, he immediately thought of Penry. When deputies arrived at Penry's home, he was wearing a khaki shirt. They noticed a little bit of blood soaking through the back of his shirt. Penry explained that he had fallen off his bike and cut himself. He removed his shirt, and the deputies noticed 2 quarter-inch deep cuts in his back. It looked like the cuts had been made with a pronged instrument, like scissors. The deputies asked Penry if he wanted to come to a crime scene, and he agreed. They drove over to Pamela Carpenter's home, and Penry stayed in the backseat of the car. He told a deputy who was in the car with him that he wanted to confess. Penry was then read his Miranda rights. Penry explained that he worked part-time as a delivery man for an appliance store. About 3 weeks earlier, he had delivered a stove to Pamela's house. He saw Pamela and he became infatuated with her. He said earlier that day he was walking around and he saw a woman who reminded him of Pamela. He also remembered seeing money in Pamela's purse. Penry said he decided to go over and sexually assault Pamela and steal her money. Penry knocked on her door and he said he was there to check to make sure that the stove was installed correctly. Pamela opened the door, but then when she saw who it was, she tried to close it quickly. Penry said he forced his way in. Pamela grabbed a pair of scissors and stabbed him in the back. He knocked her to the ground and then stomped on her several times. He then proceeded to rape her. After he was done, he got the scissors and plunged them handle deep into her chest. He said, "I love her and hated to kill her, but I had to do so she wouldn't squeal on me." But this didn't kill her. Penry said that Pamela pulled the scissors out and it freaked him out, so he ran away. After confessing, Johnny Penry was charged with murder. An autopsy was performed, and it seemed to back up Penry's confession. The scissors punctured Pamela's lung, but it didn't cause her death. On Pamela's stomach, there was a bruise in the shape of a boot print. She died from a ruptured kidney, which was most likely caused when someone stomped on her abdomen. Pamela's mother was interviewed. She said that about 3 weeks before the murder, she was there when Pamela had a stove delivered. Pamela had to leave the kitchen because one of the delivery men made her feel uncomfortable. In March 1980, before Penry went to trial, there was a competency hearing. Penry had been given an IQ test, and he scored somewhere between 50 and 63. Anything below 70 is considered an intellectual disability. It's believed that Penry's low IQ is the result of organic brain damage that most likely stemmed from trauma to the brain at birth. He had the mental age of about 6.5 to 7 years old. Penry was pulled out of school after attending the first grade for a few days. When Penry was 12, his parents sent him to live at a facility for the mentally impaired. 23-year-old Johnny Penry testified at his competency hearing. He said that he could barely read or write. He said he believed in Santa Claus and he knew that Christmas was in December. He did not know who was president or who was the governor of Texas. But he did say things that indicated that he had an awareness of his actions. For example, he was asked who the 12 people in the juror's box were. He said that they were the grand jury. He was asked what the grand jury wanted to do, and he responded, "Kill me." Penry also emphasized and made it clear that he asked the detective to write out his confession word for word. The grand jury found Penry competent to stand trial. At Penry's trial for murder in April 1980, the defense presented evidence that Penry had been abused as a child. Several people testified that he suffered horrific abuse at the hands of his mother. Then his mother testified, and she admitted that she had abused her son. The defense argued that Penry's mental condition left him with poor impulse control and an inability to learn from his experiences. Therefore, he could not be held legally responsible for the murder. The jury took less than an hour to find Penry guilty. It took them just 31 minutes to decide that he should die via lethal injection. After Penry was sentenced to death, he flew into a rage and tried to attack the district attorney. Penry's conviction and death sentence were appealed. 6 years later, in May 1986, Penry was given a stay of execution. He was just days away from being executed. In 1989, the United States Supreme Court made a ruling on the case. His conviction and his sentence were overturned. The Supreme Court essentially ruled that it was constitutional to execute someone with an intellectual disability. But when the jury was deciding Penry's sentence, they should have been able to consider if his intellectual disability played a role in the crime. If they considered it a mitigating factor, they could have given him a different sentence. This ruling led to laws being rewritten all over the country regarding sentencing people with intellectual disabilities. In June 1990, Penry had another competency hearing. At the hearing, the district attorney claimed that Penry wasn't as disabled as the defense claimed. They said he was slower than average, but he did not have an intellectual disability. They accused him of putting on an act to avoid responsibility for what he had done. The defense had several doctors who testified that Penry had the mental age of a 7-year-old. Once again, a jury found Penry competent, so he went to trial again in July 1990. His second trial was similar to the first trial. The defense argued that Penry was not responsible because of his intellectual disability. The prosecution countered that Penry was competent and he knew that his actions were wrong. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours and they found Penry guilty. After the Supreme Court ruled on Penry's case, laws were changed throughout the country regarding sentencing someone with an intellectual disability to death. Ironically, Penry didn't benefit from the ruling because the Texas legislature meets every other year. When Penry went to trial in July 1990, the laws had not been changed yet. Penry was sentenced to death a second time. Over 10 years later, on November 13, 2000, Johnny Penry was scheduled to die. Just 3 hours before Penry's date with the needle, he was given a stay of execution while the Supreme Court reviewed his case. On July 4, 2001, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to overturn Penry's death sentence. In July 2002, Penry had a sentencing hearing. A month earlier, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to execute someone with an intellectual disability. Nevertheless, for a third time, Johnny Penry was sentenced to death. In October 2005, Penry's sentence was overturned a third time because the jury was given improper instructions on how to weigh Penry's mental disability when deciding his sentence. In February 2008, a plea deal was struck. Johnny Penry was given 3 life sentences without the chance of parole. In exchange, Penry had to say he was competent and that he does not have an intellectual disability. Penry spent 28 years on death row, which is more than half of his life. At the time of this video, 64-year-old Johnny Penry is incarcerated at TDCJ Hodge Unit in Rusk, Texas. He spends most of his time coloring, drawing cartoon characters, and looking at comic books, which he cannot read. Pamela Carpenter's husband, Bruce, said that he is satisfied that Penry will die in prison. Pamela's father said that her murder disintegrated the family. After the murder, he and his wife essentially became strangers to each other. About a decade after the murder, they learned to tolerate each other. Today, Pamela's brother, the former NFL place kicker, Mark Moseley, is the director of franchising for Five Guys Burgers and Fries. Number 2. Dylan McDermott. Mark Anthony McDermott, better known as Dylan McDermott, was born in October 1961 in Waterbury, Connecticut. Dylan was first introduced to acting by his father's third wife, Eve Ensler, who is a playwright. She is best known for writing the Vagina monologues. Dylan's screen debut was in the 1987 film Hamburger Hill. His first significant supporting role was in 1993's In the Line of Fire. This led to him starring in the ABC legal drama The Practice. The role made Dylan a mainstream actor. For the role, Dylan was nominated for an Emmy, and in 1999, he won a Golden Globe. After starring in The Practice for 7 seasons, Dylan went on to star in other movies and TV series. This includes Dark Blue, The Campaign, and the first season of American Horror Story. Tragically, Dylan McDermott suffered a horrible loss in 1967. Dylan was 5 years old, and he was living with his 20-year-old mother, Diane McDermott, and his 8-month-old sister, Robin. Diane was separated from Dylan's father. On the night of February 9th, 1967, Diane's boyfriend, John Sponza, was at their apartment. Dylan heard them screaming at each other, which wasn't uncommon. But this time, he heard a gunshot. Dylan remembered being carried out of the apartment. He remembered seeing his mother being wheeled out on a gurney. Dylan saw a bloody bandage wrapped around her head. 20-year-old Diane McDermott was pronounced dead at the hospital. John Sponza told the police that the shooting had been an accident. He had been cleaning his gun, and Diane had been peeling potatoes. She picked up the gun with her left hand and walked into the pantry. He said that the gun accidentally went off and Diane was shot in the head. The chief of inspectors, Henry Burns, thought it was a plausible story, so he closed the case. Dylan and his sister were raised by their maternal grandmother. She wanted to protect the children, so for years, Dylan didn't know that his mother had died. He thought that she was just in the hospital. He then learned that his mother had died when she was accidentally shot. Later on, her boyfriend, John Sponza, said that she actually died by suicide. In 2011, 44 years after his mother's death, Dylan McDermott got in contact with the Waterbury Police Department. He asked them to examine the details of his mother's case. Police Superintendent Michael Gugliotti was assigned to the case, and he immediately noticed some problems with the case. Right away, the scene made no sense to him. The gun was found in Diane McDermott's left hand, and she was shot in the left side of the back of her head. But Diane was right-handed. Also, if she did fire the gun, there would have been nitrates on her hand from the burnt gunpowder. Her hands were tested, and no nitrates were found. Gugliotti spoke to people who knew Diane, and two things were made clear to him. The first is that Diane hated guns, and she would have never touched Sponza's gun. Secondly, there is no way she would have taken her own life. Gugliotti soon learned that John Sponza was a nefarious figure. Sponza had a terrible reputation and a lengthy criminal record. When he was just 15, he was arrested twice within 4 days in 2 different states for stealing cars. He was an angry young man who would fight anyone. He was abusive to Diane, and he took pleasure in humiliating her. Sponza was a heroin addict, but he also loved doing cocaine. Sponza was the suspected ringleader of a gang of bank robbers who had committed at least 11 robberies. It's believed that they stole somewhere in the range of $100,000 to $200,000. Accounting for inflation, that was about $770,000 to $1.5 million. Sponza and his gang were on the radar of the Waterbury Police and the FBI. Sponza and his crew were also the suspects in several murders. On February 3, 1967, a man named Harold Unsworth was found shot to death in his car. Unsworth, who was 27, had spent a third of his life incarcerated. He had connections to organized crime. John Sponza was the prime suspect in the case, but he was never charged. Unsworth was murdered just 6 days before Diane McDermott was killed. 5 years later, in May 1972, John Sponza got his 4 gang members into a car. He was in the passenger seat and his partner, James Latta, was driving. In the back seat were Alexander Jadovich, Peter Lattis, and William McNeilis. Suddenly, Sponza pulled out 2 guns and opened fire on the men in the back seat. Lattis and McNeilis were closest to the doors, so they got out quickly. Lattis was grazed with a bullet, and McNeilis wasn't shot. Jadovich was in the middle seat, and he wasn't as fortunate. He was shot to death. What happened to his body is unknown, but it's never been found. A few weeks later, on June 16, 1972, the police of Waltham, Connecticut came across a Dodge Charger that a rental company had reported missing. It had been rented by John Sponza. An officer got the trunk open, and inside of it was the dead body of 28-year-old John Sponza. He had been shot 3 times in the back. The medical examiner thought he had been dead for at least a week. No one has ever been charged in connection with Sponza's murder. After Michael Gugliotti reopened Diane McDermott's case, he talked to some informants and people who were associated with Sponza's gang. He believes that Peter Lattis ordered the hit and James Latta and William McNeilis carried out the actual shooting. Gugliotti also developed a theory as to why Diane McDermott was killed. She possibly knew about the first murder that Sponza committed, the shooting of Harold Unsworth. She may have even threatened to go to the police. Sponza shot her to make sure she didn't talk to anyone. With all the oddities with the crime scene and John Sponza being a known criminal, why did the Chief of Inspectors, Henry Burns, close the case so quickly? It turned out that there were significant problems with the Waterbury Police Department. Burns ended up leaving the force in disgrace 2 years after Diane's murder. What exactly happened has never been made public. What is known is that in March 1969, Burns and his deputy went to the home of the state attorney. They were drunk and they caused some type of disturbance in front of his home. Burns and his deputy were arrested and convicted of disturbing the peace and public intoxication. On top of a 3-month suspended sentence, Burns was suspended from the force and then he resigned. Around the same time that Burns was suspended, his department was being investigated on corruption allegations. 4 police officers were charged with accepting stolen goods. Burns was not one of them, but there are allegations that he was not on the straight and narrow. Henry Burns passed away in the year 2000 at the age of 83. Police Superintendent Michael Gugliotti said that if Johnny Sponza were alive today, he would be charged with Diane McDermott's murder. Dylan McDermott did not comment on the results of the investigation. When Dylan first talked to Gugliotti, Gugliotti asked him why he wanted to examine his mother's case after 44 years. Dylan said, "In order for me to survive, to get to where I am today, I needed to bury that moment in my life deep within myself. I've come to the point in my life where I'm able to begin to process all of this." Dylan's sister, Robin Herrera, said that the investigation results gave her a sense of relief. She said, "I'm happy to know my mother wasn't mentally ill or depressed. Somebody took her from us. She didn't leave us." Number 1. Kelsey Grammer. Alan Kelsey Grammer was born on February 21, 1955, in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. 16 months later, his mother, Sally, gave birth to a daughter, Karen. Shortly after Karen's birthday, Sally divorced the father of her 2 children, Alan Grammer. After the divorce, Sally, Kelsey, and Karen moved to New Jersey. When Kelsey was in his preteens, the family relocated to Florida. After high school, Kelsey attended the Juilliard School. He did some stage acting. He had bit parts on several TV series after Juilliard. In 1984, Kelsey Grammer landed the role that he is best known for, Dr. Frasier Crane. Kelsey was only supposed to do the character for 6 episodes on the hit show Cheers. But he was made a series regular, and he portrayed the character for the next 9 seasons. In 1993, Kelsey starred in the spin-off show, Frasier. Frasier was a massive success. Kelsey Grammer was nominated for an Emmy for all 11 seasons that the show was on the air. He won 4 times. He also won 2 Golden Globes. Kelsey has won an additional Emmy for voicing Sideshow Bob on The Simpsons, and he won a Golden Globe for his role on the Starz political drama, Boss. While Kelsey Grammer has had fantastic success in his career, he has also suffered terrible losses. When Kelsey, his mother, and his sister left St. Thomas, his father, Alan, stayed behind. Alan was a bit of a controversial figure in the city. He owned a music store, a coffee shop, and a bar. He also owned and operated a magazine called The Virgin Island View. In the spring of 1967, Alan planned to announce that he was running for political office. After Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4, 1967, there was some racial unrest in St. Thomas. On the day of Dr. King's funeral, April 9, 1967, a St. Thomas taxi driver named Arthur Bevan Niles went on a bit of a rampage. He tried to burn a house down, but he was unsuccessful. He then went to the airport and tried to set 2 cars on fire, but he couldn't get the fires going. He drove to a telephone company and tried to bomb it, but the bomb didn't explode. Around midnight, Niles drove to Alan Grammer's home. He set Alan's car on fire. Alan stepped outside to see what was going on, and he was shot twice. Alan died at the scene in the arms of his second wife. Arthur Niles was arrested shortly after the shooting. He later pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Before he went to trial, there was a competency hearing, and he was found competent to stand trial. It's not clear what happened after the hearing, but it's believed that Niles was convicted of the murder and he was incarcerated, possibly for decades. Kelsey Grammer was 13 and living in Florida when his father was murdered. Sadly, Kelsey's father was not the only person in his family to be murdered. Just over 7 years later, on July 1st, 1975, the police at Colorado Springs, Colorado, were called to a trailer park. The body of a young woman had been found by the manager of the park. The woman's body was in front of the door of the park's office. She had no pieces of identification on her. The woman had been stabbed in the neck, the back, and the hand. The hand wounds were most likely from defending herself. According to the blood trail, she had been stabbed in an alley leading into the trailer park. She walked down the alley and came into the trailer park. Blood was found on the doors of 2 mobile homes near the office. It appeared that the woman tried to seek help at both homes, but no one came to the door. She then made her way to the office, but no one was there, and she died in front of the door. For a week, the woman remained unidentified. Then a man reported his roommate missing. He had not seen her in a week. His roommate was 18-year-old Kelsey Grammer. Her 20-year-old brother, Kelsey Grammer, flew to Colorado Springs and identified the body found in the trailer park as his sister. After Karen was identified, the detective learned something that he thought couldn't be a coincidence. Karen was a waitress at Red Lobster. On the same night that Karen was murdered, she wasn't on duty, but there was an attempted robbery at the restaurant. The employees who were working that night told the police that 3 young black men came to the restaurant as they were closing. Only one of the men came into the restaurant. He was described as militant. The other 2 men stood near the door. The employees explained to the robber that the money had already been locked in the safe and they couldn't open the safe until the morning. So the robbers left empty-handed. The lead detective on the case thought that the killer lived close to the trailer park and he or she was familiar with the area. Close to the alley where Karen was stabbed was an apartment complex. The detective decided to ask the apartment complex manager if he had any men that matched the description of the robbers living in the complex. He said that he did, but the men had moved out just a few weeks earlier. They were Freddie Glenn, Larry Dunn, and Michael Corbett. Glenn was 18 years old, and he worked as a civilian employee at Fort Carson. 20-year-old Michael Corbett and Larry Dunn were soldiers at Fort Carson. The detective talked to the men's former neighbors. One of the neighbors said that a 4th man usually crashed with them. He was 21-year-old Winslow Watson. Watson's dead body had been found on the side of the road on July 25, 1975, about 3.5 weeks after Karen's murder. He had been shot 3 times in the head. The neighbors told the detective that they were worried that something they said to Corbett got Watson killed. They complained to Corbett that Watson had stolen a loaf of bread from their refrigerator. The detective was able to track down associates of the men, and he learned that the men may have been on a killing spree over the last few months. The detective located Larry Dunn. Dunn was living in New Orleans, Louisiana. In exchange for immunity, Dunn told the detective about the murders that Freddie Glenn and Michael Corbett committed. It started on June 19, 1975. Dunn said he was hanging out with Corbett and Glenn. Dunn admitted that he came up with the idea to rob someone. They came across 29-year-old Daniel Van Loan. Van Loan had just finished his shift as a cook at the Four Seasons. Dunn said that Corbett blindfolded him and had him lie on the ground. Then Corbett shot Van Loan in the head. Besides stealing his life, they also stole 50 cents from Van Loan. 8 days later, on June 27, 1975, Glenn and Corbett came across 2 men looking to buy marijuana. Glenn stayed in the car, and one of the men, 19-year-old Winford Prophet, went with Corbett to the waterfront. Corbett stabbed Prophet several times with a bayonet. Prophet died as a result of his wounds. 3 nights later, Glenn, Corbett, and a 3rd man, 20-year-old Eric McLeod, went to rob the Red Lobster, but they didn't get any money. They came across Karen Grammer in the parking lot as they were leaving. Karen had not worked that night. She had gone to the restaurant to meet up with her boyfriend, who was finishing up his shift. The 3 men kidnapped her because they thought she might be able to identify them. Dunn said they picked him up after they kidnapped Karen. Then they went and robbed a 7-Eleven store. After the robbery, they went back to their apartment. Over the next 4 hours, they took turns repeatedly raping Karen. Then they drove her to the alley. They told her that they were going to let her live. But then Freddie Glenn put a hood over her head and started stabbing her. They drove away, leaving her to die. 3.5 weeks later, Michael Corbett was drinking with 20-year-old Winslow Watson on the side of the road. Completely unprovoked, Corbett shot him 3 times in the head. Dunn confirmed that Watson had been killed because he had stolen a loaf of bread from the neighbors. On August 30th, 1975, 19-year-old Ricky Lewis was playing dice outside of a nightclub. He was shot in the back with a shotgun and died within minutes. It's suspected that Michael Corbett was the shooter. After talking to Larry Dunn, the police arrested 20-year-old Michael Corbett and 18-year-old Freddie Glenn. Then more people came forward and said that the 2 men had bragged about the murders they committed. Michael Corbett was charged with the murders of Daniel Van Loan, Winfred Profit, Winslow Watson, and Ricky Lewis. Freddie Glenn was charged with the murders of Van Loan, Watson, and Karen Grammer. The trials for all the murders were done individually in 1976. Corbett ended up only going to trial for the murders of Van Loan, Profit, and Watson. He was found guilty in each case. He was never tried for the murder of Ricky Lewis, but he is the only suspect. Corbett was sentenced to death for killing Profit, and for the other 2 convictions, he was sentenced to life. Freddie Glenn was found guilty of the murders of Watson, Van Loan, and Karen Grammer. For the murders of Watson and Van Loan, he was given a life sentence. For Karen's murder, he was sentenced to death. In 1978, Colorado abolished the death penalty, and the death sentences were commuted to life sentences with the chance of parole. Michael Corbett applied for parole in April 1996, 20 years after he was convicted. He was denied parole that time, and every other time he applied. Michael Corbett died in prison from natural causes in July 2019 at the age of 64. He had served 43 years of prison. Freddie Glenn was first able to apply for parole in 2006. At the time, he waived his right to apply. He waived his right again in 2007. In July 2009, Freddie Glenn applied for parole for the first time. He had spent 33 years of prison. Kelsey Grammer testified at the parole hearing, and he said he did not think that Glenn should be paroled. He called him a butcher and a monster. He said that there was no guarantee that Glenn wouldn't hurt anyone else if he was released. Glenn was ultimately denied parole. Once again, Kelsey Grammer testified. He said that he accepted Glenn's apology and he forgave him. But he could not approve of Glenn being released, and he thinks he should die in prison. At the time of this video, Freddie Glenn is 63 years old, and he's incarcerated at the Fremont Correctional Facility in Canyon City, Colorado. Glenn's next parole hearing is in May 2021. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Recently, we launched a podcast called Into the Killing. In each episode, we examine a cold case that was solved years later. In our latest episode, we take a look at the haunting murder of a young girl and a tragic miscarriage of justice. Into the Killing is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.